The deadline for Kurdish forces to withdraw from along the Syrian border, part of an agreement between Russia and Turkey, is now expired. And Turkey says the Kurds have not fully withdrawn, which of course is sparking some concerns that fighting will resume. Erin McLaughlin is in Turkey, across the border from Syria. What are we seeing so far? What are we hearing from the Turkish government, Erin?
Hey, Candice. Well, I think it's fair to say that fighting has resumed. In fact, some would question whether the fighting ever stopped. The expiration of the Russian brokered ceasefire agreement was yesterday, and what was supposed to happen in the wake of that was joint Turkey-Russian patrols along the so-called safe zone, monitoring the situation, making sure that Kurdish fighters were out of the so-called safe zone, as defined by the two ceasefire agreements brokered by Russia and the U.S. But Erdogan this morning saying there are still Kurdish fighters in that safe zone, and we're seeing heavy clashes, especially in the area of Ras Al Ain, which the SDF said it withdrew from days ago completely, but that doesn't seem to be the case either. What's happening is Turkish-backed militias are pushing into other areas where fighters currently are present. Clashes are also ensuing. In addition to that, we're also seeing Syrian forces in the mix, clashes between Syrian forces and the Turkish-backed militias as well. And this is a new element in this conflict. Remember that the Kurdish SDF formed an alliance with Assad's forces. Also remember that this is a Russian-backed ceasefire arrangement at this point, and Russia is one of Assad's greatest allies, and yet there's Syrian forces pushing into Ras Al Ain as well. What's exactly going on there and why they're making that push is an open question, but all of this is unfolding as today in Geneva, the foreign ministers from any number of countries, as well as the parties involved in the Syrian conflict, met to try and form some sort of constitution, a political settlement to this 8-year-long war. And what we're seeing unfold there at the Turkey-Syrian border is certainly jeopardizing that process.
And Erin, let's talk about the Trump administration's pullout move that they did. Troops from northeastern Syria were pulled out, and some troops have remained in the area. We're told to keep an eye on the oil fields. It's prompted a lot of concerns back here at home and in that region. What more are we hearing about that?
Yeah, that's right. President Trump making the announcement that he was withdrawing troops from the border areas. Following that announcement, there was what was perceived to be a remarkable flip-flop. The United States announcing that, yes, it was withdrawing from the border areas, but it was going to keep a presence guarding Syrian oil fields that currently were being guarded by the U.S. and by the Kurdish forces. We saw additional assets, U.S. military assets, moved into the region to that effect. At the time, the U.S. military was saying that the purpose of those assets, the purpose of continuing the military presence around the oil fields was to protect those oil fields against ISIS. You may remember that a big factor in the rise of ISIS was the fact that ISIS was able to seize those oil fields, and it was a very lucrative arrangement for ISIS. That's how they were able to fund their operations, the Kurds and the Americans going in and pushing them out of those areas. The U.S. making it clear that it wants to maintain that. But it also triggered a controversy because of what President Trump said. He essentially said, quote, "We're keeping the oil." And a lot of people in the U.S. and in the international community are sort of wondering, what does he mean by "we're keeping the oil"? We heard from Mark Esper, the defense secretary, earlier in the week, talk a bit about that. He was asked by a journalist if the forces, the additional U.S. forces dedicated to those oil fields were meant to deter Syria and Russia. Russia in all of this, calling this international banditry, by the way. And Esper responded saying, yes, that they were meant to deter Syria and Russia. It was meant to keep a source of revenue going for the Kurds to be able to continue to combat ISIS. But, you know, there was an outcry there in the United States that this would violate, especially if the U.S. was keeping the funds from the oil fields, any number of international agreements.
Erin McLaughlin there along the Turkish-Syrian border where the fighting apparently never did cease. Our thanks.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.